You will definitely need to know how to draw this slow spirogram and know each of these capacities and volumes. So let's quickly talk through them. The easiest one to remember is our tidal volume, so that's our middle segment here, and you can see on the right side of this diagram that our tidal volume contributes to our inspiratory capacity, vital capacity, and our total lung capacity. Do remember that if it's a capacity they're asking you for, it has to be made up of at least 2 volumes or more. Otherwise, it would simply be a volume. Up the top, we have our inspiratory reserve volume, and that contributes to our inspiratory capacity, our vital capacity, and our total lung capacity. We then have our expiratory reserve volume here in orange, and that contributes to our functional residual capacity, as well as our vital capacity and total lung capacity. And then lastly, this little one at the bottom is our residual volume, which is what we can't voluntarily breathe out, and that also contributes to that functional residual capacity and total lung capacity. Now, I have seen this graph in an exam with no labels on it, and you were asked which one was the restrictive, obstructive, and normal. So there's a couple of different multiple choice answers there. So let's talk about our restrictive conditions. So you can see there on the graph, compared to a normal person, that restrictive spirogram is sitting much lower on the graph, and that's because they are breathing at a lower lung capacity than a normal person. And that's typically because they have trouble getting air into their lungs, because their lungs are so stiff. They have great elasticity, so they recoil really well, so they don't have a lot of trouble getting air out, but getting air in with that low compliance is really challenging for them. And we think of pulmonary fibrosis when we're talking about this condition, because we remember that fibrotic tissue is really tough and resistant to any kind of movement. So overall, these guys are breathing at a much lower lung volume than normal people, sit lower on the graph, and they will use accessory muscles to inspire. They're working really hard to get air into their lungs, but exhalation is quiet and easy for them. If we compare that to our obstructive conditions, which sit a bit higher on the spirograph than a normal person, these obstructive conditions tend to have trouble getting air out mostly. So they can have trouble getting air both in and out, but it's definitely mostly out. And I like to remember O for obstructive, O for out. These type of lungs, they tend to be quite weak and floppy. So they've got great compliance, and we can get that air in, but it is much harder to get the air out because the airways are collapsing as the air leaves the lungs. So these guys have destruction of the lung tissue, and if you think of the alveolar sacs as being connected by little spider webs that help to hold them all open, those spider webs start to break down and they lose that support that's helping to hold them open. And so as that radial traction is lost, the wall of the alveolus starts to sag and drop down, and that causes an obstruction. As those airways start to collapse, or the narrow airways start to pinch, we can actually get air trapped behind them that can't escape. So as we're breathing out and those airways are sagging and pinching closed, nothing can then get past them once they've pinched closed, and we call that air trapping. Because that air physically can't get out of the lungs, it causes an increased residual volume. And we also have the fact that when you have those weak, floppy lungs and you do try to breathe out, it's quite an uncomfortable feeling. It feels really awful when your lungs are starting to collapse. And so we voluntarily don't breathe out as much air. So we are consciously keeping more air in our lungs and breathing at that higher lung volume. And that's why we sit a little bit higher compared to the normal person on the spirograph diagram you can see there. For obstructive conditions, these guys will typically breathe up in the apex of the lung, which is right up the top near our clavicles, and so they start to engage. So people with obstructive conditions breathing at really high lung volumes have their chests expanded and their shoulders raised as much as possible to try and make more room for air in their lungs, and that does use accessory muscles for both inspiration and expiration. So we know when we're looking at these spirographs that we will expect a restrictive person to be sitting the lowest possible and an obstructive person to be sitting the highest possible, while the normal person will be somewhere in between. You've got this.